November 2nd, 1983. Inside NATO command posts across Europe, officers begin rehearsing the final steps before nuclear war. The exercise is called Able Archer 83. On paper, it is a command post drill, a simulation of how NATO would move from conventional fighting to nuclear release. But this year, the drill looks different. New message formats are being tested. Alert phases are being practiced in a more realistic sequence. Political leaders are written into the scenario. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet intelligence watches and asks a terrifying question. What if the exercise is not cover for training, but cover for the real thing? This is the story of Able Archer 83, the war game that placed US-Soviet relations on what a later intelligence review called a hair trigger. At first, nothing explodes. That is what makes Able Archer so dangerous. There is no missile launch, no mushroom cloud, no emergency broadcast. There are only messages moving through command posts, alert phases being rehearsed, and officers practicing the bureaucratic steps that would precede nuclear release. To NATO, this is procedure. To Moscow, watching from the outside, procedure can look like preparation. The question is not whether NATO intends to attack. The question is whether the Soviet Union believes it does. The exercise is supposed to be fictional, but it is built from real procedures, real codes, real command chains, real assumptions about how a nuclear war would unfold. That is the trap. A simulation becomes dangerous when the other side cannot see the boundary between rehearsal and reality. And in November 1983, the Soviet Union is no longer looking at NATO with curiosity. It is looking through fear. September 1st, 1983. Korean Airlines Flight 007 is shot down by a Soviet interceptor. 269 people die. President Reagan calls it a crime against humanity. Moscow claims it was a deliberate spy mission. For 25 days, diplomatic channels are poisoned. Every radar blip is suspect. Then, on September 26th, a Soviet early warning satellite reports 5 American ICBMs inbound toward Moscow. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, reports it as a malfunction. He saves the world, but the incident does not calm Soviet nerves. It reinforces them. In Moscow, the fear of American deception is now harder to dismiss. Able Archer 83 was not designed to provoke. It was an annual NATO command post exercise, routine, predictable, and largely bureaucratic. For 5 days, NATO commanders would simulate the transition from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 1. They would practice the procedures for requesting nuclear release. They would test new communication codes. They would rehearse the choreography of nuclear war. But in 1983, Able Archer included several elements that had never been used before. Elements that, from the Soviet perspective, looked less like a drill and more like preparation for actual conflict. The first element was the changed communications traffic. NATO was testing new procedures and message formats. From the NATO perspective, this was modernization. From the Soviet perspective, monitoring from outside, it could look like wartime activation. The second element was political realism. Senior political figures were written into the scenario. Nuclear release was not treated as a vague abstraction. It was rehearsed as a chain of command. To a Soviet system already searching for signs of first strike, realism itself became dangerous. The third element was the simulated nuclear release sequence itself. NATO commanders practiced the movement from conventional conflict to escalation, to the political decision to request nuclear weapons, to the transmission of release procedures. This was standard for Able Archer. But in November 1983, standard procedure looked different because the atmosphere was different. A drill can be harmless in one decade and terrifying in another. The meaning of the signal depends on the fear of the receiver. In Moscow, the Soviet leadership was already operating under an intelligence program known as Operation Ryan, often rendered from the Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack. Its purpose was to detect signs of a Western first strike before it happened. KGB officers were told to watch for indicators that might seem strange from the outside. Unusual activity at government buildings, movements of senior officials, blood bank preparations, emergency communications, and changes around military bases. The system did not ask whether war was likely. It asked officers to find signs that war was coming. The KGB residency in London received urgent instructions from Moscow Center. Watch for unusual activity at NATO headquarters. Monitor the movements of American officials' families. Are they being evacuated? Check blood banks. Are they stocking extra supplies? Observe government offices at night. Are the lights on at 3 a.m., indicating round-the-clock war planning? These were not rational intelligence-gathering techniques. They were the desperate measures of a leadership convinced that war was coming and willing to read omens in the dark. But the instructions were real, and the pressure to find evidence of a NATO first strike was immense. Inside the KGB London residency, one officer was reading these instructions with. His name was Oleg Gordievsky. He was a senior KGB officer and a secret MI6 source. By 1983, he had access to the fear moving through Soviet intelligence channels. He saw that Moscow's questions were not normal espionage tasking. They were the questions of a leadership worried that the other side was preparing to strike first. Gordievsky warned his British handlers that Soviet anxiety was real. The message that traveled west was not that Moscow was bluffing, it was that Moscow was afraid. That difference mattered. A confident adversary can be deterred. A terrified adversary can misread deterrence as preparation. As Able Archer continued, the Soviets watched NATO's fictional nuclear release procedures and tried to decide whether fiction had become cover for fact. What happened in those 48 hours? Declassified records show that Soviet military responses were unusual. Elements of forward-based air forces were placed on heightened readiness. Intelligence collection intensified. Some reporting described preparations connected to possible nuclear operations, but the exact depth of Soviet intent is still debated. The best evidence does not prove Moscow had decided to launch. It shows something almost as frightening. Soviet forces took real precautionary steps because they feared NATO might launch first. On November 11, 1983, Able Archer 83 concluded. The exercise ended. NATO returned to normal routines. Soviet alerts eased. The world did not know it had passed through a dangerous moment, because almost no one outside intelligence channels understood what had happened. There were no mushroom clouds, no emergency broadcast, no speech telling people they had survived. Just a quiet return to normal, which is how the closest calls often end. The full scope of the Able Archer scare only emerged after the Cold War ended. In 1990, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, PFIAB, launched a retrospective investigation. They interviewed Soviet officials. They reviewed declassified documents from both sides. And they reached a conclusion that shocked the American national security establishment. Able Archer 83 had been one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War. The report concluded that Soviet fear of a NATO first strike was genuine, not feigned. The report concluded that the Soviet military response was real, not theatrical. And the report concluded that NATO had been dangerously ignorant of how its exercises were being perceived in Moscow. Able Archer also changed how we understand Ronald Reagan's final Cold War years. Reagan did not become a different man overnight because of one exercise, but the war scare contributed to a broader realization. Soviet leaders were not only aggressive, they were afraid. That insight mattered. It helped create space for direct communication, arms control diplomacy, and the path that eventually led toward the Reykjavik summit and the INF Treaty. Able Archer was not the sole cause of détente, but it was one of the shocks that made the danger of miscalculation impossible to ignore. Gordievsky's role would remain hidden for years. In 1985, after suspicion fell on him in Moscow, MI6 executed an extraordinary escape operation and smuggled him across the Finnish border. His intelligence later helped the West understand the depth of the 1983 war scare. The key lesson of his story is not that one spy single-handedly saved the world. It is that one well-placed source can reveal what satellites and intercepts cannot. The emotional state of an adversary. Machines can count aircraft. They cannot always measure fear. In 2026, Able Archer matters because military signaling is becoming faster, more automated, and more ambiguous. Hypersonic weapons compress decision time. Artificial intelligence is entering warning systems. Nuclear treaties have weakened or collapsed. Large exercises continue near contested borders. The old problem remains. From the outside, a defensive drill can resemble an offensive rehearsal. A communications change can look like modernization or mobilization. A movement of aircraft can look like deterrence or preparation. The signal depends on who is afraid when they receive it. The fundamental vulnerability that Able Archer exposed remains unchanged: the inability to distinguish between preparation and provocation. From the outside, a defensive exercise looks identical to an offensive rehearsal. A movement of troops can be interpreted as deterrence or as threat. A change in communications protocol can be modernization or mobilization. In 1983, it took a double agent to bridge that gap. In 2026, with decision times compressed and trust evaporated, the gap is wider than ever. The question is not whether another Able Archer could happen. The question is whether, when it happens, there will be a Gordievsky in position to warn us. Consider the psychology of nuclear deterrence. Deterrence depends on rational actors making calculated decisions. It depends on leaders who can distinguish between threat and bluff, between exercise and attack, between error and aggression. But the Soviet leadership in 1983 was not operating rationally. They were operating from fear. A fear that had been cultivated by years of rhetoric, by KAL 007, by the Petrov incident, by the ideological conviction that the West wanted to destroy them. And fear, once activated, does not respond to rational calculation. It responds to confirmation. It seeks evidence of threat and ignores evidence of reassurance. Able Archer 83 proved that deterrence is not a mechanical system. It is a psychological one, and psychology is fragile. That is why the 75-day arc of 1983 matters. September 1st, KAL 007. September 26th, Petrov. November 2nd through 11th, Able Archer. 3 events, each different in mechanics, each connected by atmosphere. A navigation error, a satellite false alarm, a war game. None of them alone guaranteed nuclear war. Together, they show how the Cold War could turn ordinary systems into engines of escalation. We survived. But survival was not guaranteed. It required luck, restraint, and people inside vast systems choosing not to make the signal louder. The world survived Able Archer not because the system worked perfectly, but because it failed softly enough. Peruts did not escalate. Gordievsky's warnings helped reveal Soviet fear. NATO ended the exercise. Soviet forces stood down. That is not a victory story. It is a warning story. It tells us that civilization can depend on restraint by people whose names almost no one knows. The story of Able Archer 83 does not end with the exercise. It continues in the INF treaty that followed years later. It continues in every transparency measure designed to stop drills from looking like attacks. And it continues in every military exercise that walks the line between deterrence and provocation. We must remember the 48 hours. We must remember the spy who warned the West. We must remember that the brink is not a moment. It is a condition. Subscribe to Turning Point Histories so you don't miss the next chapter. New videos every week. In the next video, we leave the Cold War behind and travel back to the tunnels of Nazi Germany. A weapon that killed more people building it than at its targets. A scientist who traded his SS uniform for an American suit. Stay tuned for V2, the weapon that changed war forever. New codes. Real fear. A simulated nuclear release. One spy's warning. One general's restraint. One world left. Stay with us.